Let's look at a really cool modern Bowie knife made for me and sent to me as a gift, but made of antique steel. Hi folks, Matt Easton here, Schola Gladiatoria. Now, first up, I would say that this was sent to me as a gift, but I absolutely love it. Will Goodwin is the maker of this knife. Now, he doesn't have a website. He's a part-time and hobbyist smith making knives for a long time, for many, many years. If you like what you see in here and you want to get in contact with him, then you can contact me at, let's say, the Schola Gladiatoria channel at gmail.com, and I will forward you his email address because he doesn't have anywhere else I can link to, no Instagram or anything like that. So he is just out there making knives, but this is a particularly interesting one. So first up, it is fundamentally a Bowie knife, or Bowie knife if you prefer to say it that way. I haven't actually measured the blade, but by the look of it, it's about 7 inches long. It's not a particularly big Bowie knife, and it's quite compact, but what's really special about this is the steel that the blade is made of, and I'll get to that in a second. So first of all, he's used antique steel, which I'll talk about in a second. The hilt fittings are mild steel and brass, and this is African blackwood, I think. It's some type of dark African wood anyway. Very, very, very nice. And the shape of this, I mean, it's a coffin handle style grip, isn't it? And I'm a big fan of coffin shaped grips on Bowie knives. They just sit really well in my hand, and I actually do a fair amount of knife fighting stuff. It's one of my regular go-to sparring things in my twice a week training, and I'm gradually pulling more people over to the dark side and doing more and more knife training with some people. But the way that I grip a Bowie knife personally is essentially how I grip a sabre, and a lot of how I use a Bowie knife is informed by my sabre, my military sabre fencing, 19th century style, combined with elements of Langmesser and various other things that I've done. So the way that I grip it is with the thumb up the back, and I find that coffin hilted Bowie knives sit really, really nicely in the grip, and they give a nice sort of recess or scoop, I suppose, for the thumb to sit up there, up the back, which gets the point on line. And contrary, I think, to how a lot of people necessarily think of a Bowie knife, it's certainly, to me, not at all intended to be used like a machete or even a sort of parang or barong or something like that. Instead, it is predominantly a stabbing, a thrusting implement that can also cut, usually as countercuts, but maybe, again, I have mentioned this in the past, maybe we'll look at that in the future. If you want to see me maybe extol some of my ideas on knife fighting in future videos, then I will do, and I think it could be an interesting topic to explore. But back to this knife. So the guard and the butt cap, if we want to call it that, are made of mild steel, but then you'll notice that there is a brass peen block, we could call it, and there is actually, so for various reasons, again I'll get to the blade in a second, Will would normally put a little maker's insignia in the blade, but this blade had dulled his punches. Okay, he couldn't get into it enough, and it is a fairly thin blade. It's about 3.5 millimeters thick, so you might not want to go very deep into it anyway, but he couldn't put the inlay in the blade, so he's actually put, I don't know if you'll be able to see this on camera, yeah, you can just about, he's put a nice little brass inlay symbol in the guard up here. So it's beautifully made. The fit and finish is superb. The polish on the wood, it's like absolutely pro level, really smooth, really satin. This is actually, I've had this for a couple of months now. This has actually been sitting on my desk, and I play with it a lot. It just feels lovely in the hand, and it's also really sharp as well. I don't have a piece of paper. Well, I do have a piece of paper actually with some stuff written on it, but he's sharpened it up really, really well, and you can see how sharply that cuts. It is super sharp. Now, apart from the fact this is a very nicely made knife by Will, and he presumably will take commissions and stuff, so get in contact with me and I'll put you in contact with him if you want to commission something or talk to him. The really super interesting thing about this blade is it's fairly thin, and that's for a reason I'll explain in a second. It is made of antique steel that Will found and has been making certain things out of. And he has given this a light etch, and you can actually see a sort of pattern in the blade. I don't know if you're going to be able to pick it up on camera. Oh yeah, you can just about. So it's almost like woots. Now, regular viewers of this channel, can you see that there? You can see these kind of almost swirly, or at least watered type of patterns in the steel. Now, regular viewers of this channel will know that I have a series of actual woots things: Indian, Afghan, Persian. In fact, there's a Persian woot sword right behind the camera right now, as it happens, a Shamshir. And so I've got a number of woots things in my collection. I'm also friends with Matthew Ford, who's written some interesting stuff about woots. He's been involved with re-etching antique woots to bring out the pattern again during the process of restoration, because of course if you get any kind of corrosion or even patina on the blade, it can hide the pattern of the woots, so kind of bringing back out the glory of the woots, as it were, in a sympathetic and gentle way. I myself have also done, you will hopefully have seen, if you search in my videos, woots, which is W-O-O-T-Z, I have a sword which I've etched myself. Well, in fact, I've got several which I've etched myself to bring out woots pattern in. I've also got an Indian Qatar punch dagger which I brought woots pattern out in. So I'm kind of familiar with woots. So Will was sort of kind of puzzled when he found that this had a similar pattern in it to woots. Now, I'm going to read what Will told me. Apologies to Will, he didn't want this expressed in. I'll paraphrase. So, Will says, about 10 years ago, his wife and I were looking through a large antique mall in his home state of Virginia. And he saw in the corner a massive ice saw, which was a small amount of money. Okay, now an ice saw is not something you encounter in the United Kingdom very much, but I am aware of what they are. So in places where they have huge blocks of ice, clearly ice was sawn up and distributed. It was sold, you know, for preservation of food and use in all sorts of basically stuff to do with catering and preservation. And so ice saws, if you imagine, if you're chopping up, if you're sawing ice, not only does the saw have to be big and have quite certain type of teeth on it, but it has to be really hard, really tough steel, okay, because you all know ice is really hard and really brutal on steel blades. Anybody who's watched like Forged in Fire and seen them chopping through ice blocks will know it dulls a blade. Well, if you've got a saw which needs to repeatedly cut through ice, it has to really be good steel. And this saw blade, he says, it was huge, 5 feet long. Okay, I'm 6 feet long, so it's up to about there on me. Massive blade. And really thick, about 5 millimeters thick. So this is a massive piece of steel. And so he bought it. Now he checked to see if the original heat treatment was there. And interestingly, he said it was very stiff. Now, normally if you've got something which is 5 millimeters thick by 5 feet long, sorry to mix metric and imperial there, but that's typically British for you. Usually it would flex fairly easily. Yeah, if you think of a saw blade, even a 5 millimeter thick one, it, you know, have a decent amount of flex to it. And you think about something like a Zweihander, they're usually fairly flexible blades. But he says that it took everything he had just to flex it 4 or 5 inches, and it instantly returned to true. So it was really, really stiff. Now, why might that be? Something to do with the type of steel, something to do with the type of heat treatment, or both. I don't know. And so he subsequently has made a couple of swords out of it. He's made a chef's knife, and he's made this Bowie knife for me, which he's a viewer of the channel and he offered to give it to me, and I'm extremely grateful for that, and the least I can do is to big up his work and you know, spread his reputation. And he still has a little bit left, but don't go chasing after him necessarily, because I don't know how much he's got left for that particular steel, but he can make nice knives, so I'm sure he can make you something with another piece of steel, perhaps even antique steel if he's got some more. Now, this is the interesting thing to me from a historical perspective. He says that there was a maker's stamp on the saw blade, and it read Wheeler, Madden and Clemson XLCR, which, now that's an XLCR is interesting. In Sheffield steel, we have IXL is a maker's mark on George Wolfenstone Sheffield Bowie knives. Maybe that's somehow related to that. XL, so XL the letters, but of course it's a it's a sort of play on words, isn't it? It's like IXL, IXL. So it was a sort of marketing thing. Maybe this is something to do with that, I don't know. Middletown, New York. So it's American steel, made in America, made in New York. And it said warranted cast steel extra, 1885. Well, so it was dated. And how cool is that? So we know that this is made from American steel from what we would call the Victorian era, 1885. So this is, what is it, 140 years old steel. Now, he says that he left the treatment and temper alone because he could never have got it any better than it already was. However, he did anneal the tang. This is a subject. So he says, much like me, he believes that tangs should be annealed. There are lots of people out there making swords and knives today with fully heat-treated tangs. I am not a fan of this for numerous reasons. I've made videos about this in the past. Historically, tangs were often iron, forge-welded, cleft or scarf-welded onto a steel blade. Okay, and it doesn't matter whether you're talking about Japanese swords or European Sheffield Bowie knives. Very often they had a steel blade forge welded to an iron tang. I believe there is a lot to be said for having an annealed or soft tang. It's more forgiving. If it bends a bit, it's not a disaster. If a tang breaks, it's a disaster. Okay. Now, lots of people would argue with modern steel and modern heat treatment, there's no disadvantage to having a hardened tang. Well, I think why not soften it anyway? You don't lose anything by softening the tang, and potentially you gain a lot and you make it potentially tougher. But anyway, he, like me, believes in a softened tang. So what he did is he didn't touch the heat treatment at all in the blade, but he did soften the tang, annealed the tang. He says he used mild steel and brass for the fittings and African blackwood for the handle. And he said the blade completely dulled his punch, so he had to put his maker's mark on the underside of the guard, as I've shown, and he lightly etched it to bring out some of the grain and some of the pattern that we've just been speaking about. And he says even though the blade's only about 3mm thick, it is really tough and he can barely get it to flex. Now, just to demonstrate that, this is true, it does flex. Okay, but this is a pretty thin blade. I've measured it with my calipers and it's over 3mm. It's maybe about 3.5. But look, I'm applying, well, be careful because that's sharp. I've actually slightly cut myself. Oops. Look, you can flex it, but I'm applying quite a lot of force. It is super, super thick. And the weird thing, I'm not actually bleeding, it's just cut the surface level of my skin. But the weird thing is, this actually corresponds to some of the things we see written in 19th century sources about woots. They sometimes say that woots steel is incredibly hard on the edge and surface, and this is, and that it's very, very stiff. Much stiffer than a blade of comparative size and proportions and thickness and taper made of typical carbon steel. So, what is this steel? All we know is it was made in New York in 1885, finest cast steel. It was made for cutting ice, very high requirement. However they made this, whatever type of steel alloy this is, and bear in mind that all steel is slightly different, it will all have slightly different amount of, obviously, carbon, but also things like sulfur and phosphorus and manganese and sometimes vanadium and chromium and nickel and other things mixed in with it. So all alloyed steels all have different properties. Without chemical analysis, we don't know exactly what this steel is, because it was made in 1885. They wouldn't have known exactly what it was. They just made the steel the way they made it, I guess. And we don't know how it's been heat treated either. However, we can see that it does have a spring temper. Okay, so it flexes and returns to true. So it's not only edge quenched or something like that. So what an absolutely fascinating thing and utterly unique. Antique steel of very high quality, very high hardness, but completely unknown makeup, chemical composition, and completely unknown heat treatment. But boy, does it work. Boy, is it sharp. As I just cut my finger slightly on, I'm fine, I'll survive. My tetanus is up to date. Really, really sharp. Look at this thing, just lovely. Super sharp, and obviously the sharpness is down to Will's sharpening, but it's super, super sharp. and super hard, so hard that it dulled Will's tools. Fascinating. So, as always, I think most people out there who are doing bladesmithing, making knives or even swords or other axes or other things, often recycle material from the past. What a great thing to do if something's just lying there unused and unloved and it's never going to be used as that thing again. Why not recycle it into something that's valued? And I think for me personally, when I read about accounts of how Woots was how they think Woots was made and the properties of Woots in the past, and other types of steel as well, in the past in historical accounts, it highlights to me that a lot of the time historical blades, they didn't know exactly the composition of steel, and in many cases you didn't know that particular workshop. You knew that they made amazing blades, but you didn't know how they made them because that was a secret, trade secret. You didn't know how they hardened them, how they were quenched, how they were tempered. And you know, this might have been, that company in New York might have been a similar case of that. They'd worked out how to make really good ice saws, and they weren't going to tell any of their competitors because they probably made damn good ice saws. And do you know what? They've ended up making a damn good knife. So, Will, thank you so much for sending this to me. I super appreciate it. I love it. It fits in my hand great. I need to get a scabbard made for it, but it's just a great general purpose knife that I'm sure will stay super sharp for many years to come because of how hard it is. Thanks a lot for watching, folks. Like I say, if you want to get in contact with Will, because he can clearly make good knives, and maybe commission something or talk to him further, then drop a contact to me at Schola Gladiatoria channel@gmail.com, and I will forward you his email address. Thanks a lot for watching, and I'll see you back on the channel really soon. Cheers, folks.